the same vein, we have this story of, it's not really a story that's straight from the Bible as much as Go Down Moses was, but it still has this very much of a scriptural presence and influence to it. So let's just look at the text quickly just to reacquaint ourselves. We start with a chorus for this, and that just reads, Deep river, my home is over Jordan. Deep river, Lord, I want to cross over into campground. Then we go into a bridge. Oh, don't you want to go to that gospel feast, that promised land where all is peace? Oh, deep river, Lord, I want to cross over into campground. So the scriptural reference here, again, it's not as obvious as the story of Exodus and the Israelites, but there's some hints about crossing over Jordan, which is a river, right? River Jordan, which got the Israelites into the promised land, if you read to the end of the story in Exodus. So there's, again, this connection with freedom and the promised land. There's also a little bit of a hint of death and heaven, right? And crossing the river and venturing into this afterlife, you know, and freedom in that, freedom in death. Do you think that, looking at the text, that there's a hidden layer, a deeper meaning behind the text?
Yeah, I think basically the rivers were boundaries in the South, particularly in Mississippi and Missouri. And there was freedom for the slaves, for instance. If you get through either Missouri, like the Ohio and so on, there was freedom and so on. I think some of that attaches to those nirvanas or whatever, if you will, that were there for the slave, if he could make it, and so on.
Exactly.
That was the promised land.
The free states.
Right.
Across on the other side of the Ohio River.
The free state.
Actually, even Canada. Because
Yeah.
the Free States after 1840 had to return slaves. So the goal was then to get to Canada.
Right.
To get on the,
Right.
the Underground Railroad and so on.
What was his name? There's a group actually out of Toronto that is Afrocentric, is how they describe themselves. Called them the Family Greater Gardner Center.
Right.
Their director was very definite. It was not at all about spirituality. It was about escape.
Escape.
It was about freedom.
Not escape.
The Jordan could have been Missouri,
Any of
Mississippi,
Yep.
could have been the Ohio, but he said Canada, baby.
To get on the Underground Railroad to get up there.
Yeah.
One of the things we wanted to explore a little deeper was the use of the word campground at the end of the chorus. What does that mean? Yeah.
It refers to the old, when they had camp meetings,
Yeah.
way back when, they had the group just come
Yeah, exactly.
and work with people.
Campground is not actually a biblical term. It's not from the Bible, but it is a scripture-based term in that it's a church-based term, I guess I should say, instead of a scripture-based term. And so in the South, even still today, they have camp meetings, and the purpose of that is sort of a series of worship services over the course of several days, or over the course of a week. They have camp meeting week, and so there's a church service every day. So everybody comes out, every day, or even a couple times a day for worship and for this community. So some churches in the South at this time had actual plots of land for their camp meetings, and they would call them campgrounds. And they had sort of a main pavilion set up in the middle, which is where everyone would congregate to worship. And then they had what they called tents built along the outskirts of this piece of property, surrounding this center meeting house pavilion. And the tent is a biblical term, but it's actually a cabin. It was a place where people could sleep, and they had stoves, and they could cook. So you could come there for a period of how many days or a week and live there, and then you'd be right there to gather for worship. So the sense of campground could have a couple different meanings. It could be that crossing over into campground, meaning a place where the slaves could worship freely, where they could worship how they wanted to instead of how their masters wanted them to, where they could be free to incorporate the African traditions that they were familiar with from back home. And it could also mean this place of freedom and community where they the churches of balconies or the outskirts of these pavilions kind of being left out. And for the slaves that had converted to Christianity by this time, they could be referring to this actual campground, but again, being able to worship as a community and as equals.
All right, so musically, again, there's a nice complement between the music and the text here. And it's very different from God on Moses. Thief River is very lyrical, right? It's a little more water-like, which makes sense. It's flowing. And there's a couple interesting things we wanted to point to. The highest note, or sort of climax in the entire piece, happens on the word promised. So if you see your text, oh, don't you want to go to that gospel feast, that promised land where all is peace. We're going to play that for you so you can hear that. And also the last word there, peace. We would expect when we hear peace, if the music was going to complement the text in the way we expect, we'd expect peace to be very restful, might be revived, right? And it's actually not that way. You'll hear that. And so that kind of gives us an interesting perspective on maybe what they meant by peace. Maybe it was there was an underlying idea that peace isn't here yet. We're not quite resolved. And I think you hear that. So we're going to play from Oh, Don't You Want to Go, and then we're going to end on peace. Not quite the same. So those are kind of interesting musical things that really have an impact. So we'll play the whole piece now.